President. Mr. President, I come to the Senate floor to discuss a very important topic, and one that itself is coming to the Senate floor soon, and that's the problem of illegal immigration and proposals for so-called comprehensive immigration reform. Specifically, of course, the Gang of Eight bill, as it's been dubbed, is being reported out of the Judiciary Committee, and we'll be debating that bill and hopefully a lot of important amendments to it soon in June here on the Senate floor. Now, Mr. President, let me say at the outset, I think there are at least a couple of things we can all agree about. Number one, I think we can all agree that the United States is an immigrant nation with a proud history of immigration, legal immigration, and it's absolutely one of the core features of our nation that makes us unique and that makes us strong. And so I want to say that up front very proudly, very strongly. I support that tradition, that history of our being an immigrant nation. Every one of us, are the children of immigrants. Not a question of if, it's just a question of when, because that's the nature of America, and that goes to the core of our strength. Number two, Mr. President, the other thing I think we can all agree about is that our present immigration system is broken. In fact, it's badly, badly broken, and we need to fix the system. Now, as I said a minute ago, we have a proud history of immigration, legal immigration, and that's the tradition, that's the history we need to get back to. Unfortunately, right now we have a system of wide open illegal immigration, almost open borders in some cases in some areas, and that desperately needs to be fixed. Now, having said that, Mr. President, I have real and fundamental concerns with the so-called Gang of Eight bill, and they fall into 5 or 6 big categories, and I want to talk about each of those important categories in turn. First and foremost, Mr. President, really my biggest and my most fundamental concern, I think this so-called Gang of Eight bill repeats mistakes of the past, because at its core, it's amnesty now and enforcement later, and maybe never. We've tried that model before. We've tried it several times before, and it's never worked. The most clear example is the 1986 immigration overhaul. That bill at its core was the same model, amnesty now and enforcement later, and maybe never. And in fact, much of that enforcement was never. And that's why it didn't work. The amnesty kicked in immediately, the millisecond the bill was signed into law. And that was a powerful message to invite more and more illegal crossings across the border, more illegal immigrants into our country. That part of the bill, that part of the message was heard loud and clear. The promises of enforcement never fully materialized. Many of them never materialized at all. And so what happened when you had that combination of an immediate amnesty with promises of enforcement that never materialized? Well, again, you attracted more illegal crossings. You had no capability or will to do anything about them. And so, Mr. President, the promise then was, we're just going to have to do this once. The system will be fixed. We'll never have to look back. We'll never have to look in the rearview mirror. The problem will be solved. And what happened? Well, we all know the problem wasn't solved. In fact, the problem wasn't simply continued. The problem was quadrupled. What was 3 million illegal immigrants then, they were mostly made legal. But that number, 3 million, quadrupled. And now today we have 11, 12 million illegal immigrants, some think more. That, at its core, is the Gang of Eight bill, an immediate amnesty, promises of enforcement, and that's not good enough, particularly when we have decades of the federal government, Republicans and Democrats, who have promised this before and have never delivered. The American people say, we'll trust, but we want to verify. Trust but verify. We need to see this enforcement in action before we move on to anything else. In fact, in some ways, this Gang of Eight bill is worse in terms of that basic model than previous versions like 1986. Because if you look at page 70 of the bill, it actually has a period of an enforcement holiday. So 2.5 years of a pure enforcement holiday. So not only is that this amnesty now and enforcement later, maybe never, applied to folks who are in the country illegally now, but they can keep coming. The message will be sent out, and they can come the day after the bill passes, the week after the bill passes, the year after the bill passes, 2 years after the bill passes, and it's part of the same amnesty. They will get the benefits of that amnesty as well. That enforcement holiday, 2.5 years, makes that combination of a big amnesty now with only promises of enforcement later even more potentially disastrous. Mr. President, the second big problem I have with the bill as it's currently put together is it doesn't enforce the law, and it doesn't enforce the border, particularly the troublesome southern border with Mexico, and it doesn't enforce other enforcement provisions, doesn't actually guarantee that those are put into place and executed in an effective way. The proponents of the bill talk about so-called triggers in the bill before the amnesty, before the new legal status is granted. But when you look hard at what the triggers are, they're triggers on a toy plastic gun, not real triggers in any meaningful sense of the term. The triggers basically narrow down to two things. First of all, the Secretary has to submit 2 reports, 2 plans. The Secretary of Homeland Security has to submit plans or reports, a so-called, quote, comprehensive southern border security strategy. So she has to submit a strategy. Great. This was promised for 3 decades, but now she has to submit a strategy, a piece of paper, and a, quote, southern border fencing strategy, close quote. So that's one trigger. The other triggers are certification that the border security strategy is, quote, substantially deployed and substantially operational, close quote. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, 2 things. Who the heck knows what substantially deployed means? And number 2, even more troublesome, you know who has to certify that? The Secretary of Homeland Security, who has not been effective at enforcement to date in any way, shape, or form. So those so-called triggers are absolutely meaningless. The bill doesn't require a fence, as is actually required under present law, so we're weakening that. We're walking away with that. It weakens current law regarding border security. Operational control is the standard now, and that's being weakened, changed to effective control. And it doesn't require a biometric data system for entry and exit screening. That has been pushed by Congress since 1996. Congress started mandating this in 1996, and it was one of the prime recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, full deployment of the U.S. visit system. The 9/11 Commission said that needs to be a high priority. That's exactly how the 9/11 terrorists got into our country and overstayed their visas. Doesn't do any of that. So again, enforcement holiday for 2.5 years and no border security now before the amnesty kicks in. Number 3, I'm very concerned that we will continue the present status quo, which is significant benefits being available to these immigrants, which act as a magnet to incent other illegal immigrants to come into the country. Now, the so-called Gang of Eight makes all sorts of promises about certain benefits not kicking in until full citizenship is granted down the road. But many benefits would kick in immediately. certainly participation in the Social Security system, certainly all those Social Security benefits, and there are loopholes about these benefits. I think many illegal immigrants will clearly gain access to public benefits far sooner than any 13 years as advertised. So that is another serious weakness of the bill. Fourth, Mr. President, I'm very concerned about the cost of this bill. Now, the authors of this bill have been very, very clever. They saw that cost issue coming, and they devised the bill so that the big costs of the bill are outside the 10-year budget window. Now, why is that important? Well, not to get into the weeds, but it's very important because CBO scores legislation primarily on its impact on taxes and spending in the first 10 years. And so the authors of the bill were very careful, very clever in devising a bill that would look okay in the first 10 years with regard to cost. But after that first 10-year window, the costs explode, and none of that will be reflected by the CBO score. We've seen this movie before, Mr. President, because this is exactly the same approach to CBO scoring and costs of legislation, exactly the same approach that the proponents of Obamacare put forward. They were very, very clever to push many of the costs in the out years beyond the first initial scoring window. And that's why they were able to wave CBO scores around to somehow suggest this would help lessen the deficit. It's perfectly clear now, Mr. President, Obamacare is not going to make our fiscal situation better. It's going to make it far, far worse and far more onerous. I believe exactly the same thing is true with this bill in terms of the cost, and I believe the proponents of the bill, quite frankly, have gamed the system in the same way to hide those costs, given the way CBO scores legislation. Now, in contrast to that, there is an objective study of the full costs of the bill, and that is a study by Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation. And he went into extreme detail tracking the full costs and fiscal benefits of the bill. And his conclusion was that the full costs of the bill are $6.3 trillion over the full life and the full impact of the bill. $6.3 trillion with a T. He concluded that the bill, because of all the folks that would legalize, would kick in $9.4 trillion in government benefits. So more government benefits we're going to have to pay out, $9.4 trillion. Now, these folks being legalized would pay some taxes into the system, which they do not pay now, and that would be $3.1 trillion. But when you subtract 3.1 from 9.4, that obviously doesn't net out to zero. That's a net increase in the deficit, increased costs to the government, to society, to the taxpayer of $6.3 trillion net. That's a serious impact on these budget and fiscal issues we're already very, very concerned about. The Robert Rector study is very credible. It's very detailed. I've seen no comparable study in terms of the detail of the analysis. And I would challenge anyone who cares about this issue, wherever they're coming from, to put up any other study that can compete with the Rector study in terms of detail and analysis. I think currently that is the last and final word on costs of the bill. Two final points, Mr. President. Fifth big concern I have about the bill is I believe this bill is very unfair to legal immigrants and folks who are waiting in line in the legal immigration system now. It puts some people, not everybody who would be made legal, but some people ahead of them in line, and really dishonors the fact that these would-be legal immigrants are following the rules now and following the law now. And sixth and finally, and this is no trivial matter, I am very concerned that this would depress wages in the United States for many, many hard-working Americans, legal immigrants, others who have followed the law, who are working hard in a very, very tough economy now. I think it would depress the general wage situation and make that more difficult for them to deal with. So in closing, Mr. President, I urge all of my colleagues to look carefully at these and other concerns and try to address them fully, directly, completely on the Senate floor. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.